Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back in time to a place of immense contradictions, a place that officially declared itself a paradise for workers, but often felt more like a grand, bleak, and sometimes absurd social experiment. We are heading into the Soviet Union, and we're not going to focus on the grand battles or the 5-year plans. No, we're going to look at something far more private, and in its own way, far more revealing. The hidden, confusing, and often desperate world of love, sex, and intimacy under the red flag. It's a story about a state that tried to engineer the human heart, and the messy, resilient ways the heart refused to cooperate. To be honest, if you were dropped into this world, with its grand ideals and its grinding reality, you probably wouldn't have lasted the first day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, I'd love it if you could tell me what city you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see where we're all drifting off to sleep from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the air. It's thin, cold, and smells of coal smoke, damp wool, and an almost electric sense of possibility. It's Petrograd. Just after the revolution, the world has been turned upside down. The old order is gone, swept away by a tide of red banners and fervent speeches. And with it, all the old rules are suddenly up for debate. Not just who owns the factories, but who owns your life, who defines what a family is. What is love in a world without private property? You are young, and you feel this change in your very bones. You march, you attend meetings, you help distribute pamphlets with ink that smudges on your cold fingers, and you listen. You hear a new and intoxicating idea being passed around, whispered in crowded dormitories and debated passionately over weak tea. It's a theory most famously articulated by a prominent female Bolshevik, Alexandra Kollontai. The idea is simple, radical, and perfectly logical in this new world. In a communist society, she argues, satisfying one's desires should be no more complicated than quenching one's thirst. Sex, stripped of all its bourgeois baggage, the dowries, the property arrangements, the religious guilt, should be as straightforward as drinking a glass of water. This glass of water theory feels like a breath of fresh air. It's liberation. It means that attraction doesn't have to be a prelude to a lifelong contract of ownership. It can be an honest, comradely act between two equal members of the new society. You see it in the people around you. Young men and women interact with a casualness that would have been scandalous just a few years earlier. The lines are blurred. Marriage and divorce are made incredibly simple, a matter of a simple postcard registration. For a fleeting moment, it seems like the revolution isn't just political. It's a revolution of the soul. But was this truly a widespread movement? That's a question historians still argue about. Some believe it was a genuine, grassroots sexual revolution among the youth, a wild, chaotic, and ultimately empowering moment. Others suggest it was more of an intellectual fantasy, an idea confined to a small circle of bohemian revolutionaries in the big cities, later blown out of proportion by both Soviet propagandists who wanted to condemn it and Western observers who were fascinated by it. The reality was likely somewhere in between, a confusing mix of genuine liberation, opportunism, and moral panic all happening at once. In the midst of this ideological whirlwind, you might even witness one of the stranger, more extreme offshoots of this new freedom. You're walking down a main street and you see them, a small, earnest group calling themselves the Down with Shame Society, and they are marching, completely naked, right through the city center, chanting slogans against bourgeois modesty. They even try to ride the trams, much to the shock and bewilderment of the other passengers. It's a bizarre, almost comical footnote in history, a flash of radical performance art that shows just how far some were willing to push the boundaries. They saw shame, like private property, as a relic to be discarded. But this period, this brief, intoxicating thaw, is not destined to last. The glass of water, it turns out, is a little too messy for the leaders of the revolution. Vladimir Lenin himself grows wary. He looks at the youth, sees their passions, and worries this energy is being misplaced. In a famous conversation, he criticizes the glass of water theory, not because it's immoral, but because it's a distraction. He argues that a revolutionary's energy is a precious resource, one that must be channeled into the class struggle, into building the new state, not into what he saw as a chaotic and draining mass sport of sexuality. He worries that this so-called free love is just bourgeois decadence in a new, revolutionary disguise. And when Lenin speaks, the party listens. The mood begins to shift. The air, once filled with possibility, starts to feel heavier, more controlled. The idea of sex as a simple, private act is slowly being replaced by a new, more austere message. The needs of the collective, you are told, must come before the desires of the individual. The glass of water is being taken away, and soon it will be replaced by a new kind of doctrine, a puritanical, almost monastic ideal, where the only true passion should be for the revolution itself. You can feel the brief, wild summer of love coming to an end, and a long, cold winter of ideology is about to begin. The chill you felt at the end of that brief revolutionary summer was just in the air. It was a deep, ideological cold front moving in. The glass of water theory is no longer a daring topic of debate. Now, it's a heresy. You hear the name call anti-spoken with a sneer. In factory meetings and youth league gatherings, a new catechism is being drilled into you. The message is hammered home with the relentless rhythm of a steam press. Romantic love, in its pure, untethered form, is a bourgeois indulgence. It is a wasteful, inefficient, and fundamentally selfish act. You are told that the energy you expend on courtship, on passion, on the messy complexities of a relationship, is energy stolen from the collective. It's a kilowatt of power that could have gone into building a new tractor, a day of labor that could have helped meet the 5-year plan. Your body is not your own, not really. It is a resource belonging to the state, a tool for production and, if necessary, defense. To weaken it with sleepless nights of passion or emotional turmoil is tantamount to sabotage. The new ideal is a kind of revolutionary asceticism. The only pure, noble love is the love for the party, for your comrades as a whole, and for the shining communist future you are all building together. You see this new ideal everywhere. It's on the posters plastered onto brick walls. The men and women depicted are not gazing into each other's eyes. They are gazing, with chiseled jaws and determined expressions, toward a distant horizon where a new dam is being built or a field of wheat is being harvested. They are comrades, standing shoulder to shoulder, their hands holding not each other, but a hammer, a sickle, or a rifle. The message is clear. Intimacy is found in shared labor, not in the bedroom. Romance is a footnote to the grand narrative of industrialization. This new doctrine creates a buzz, or set of psychological gymnastics you have to perform. Take, for instance, the emotion of jealousy. In the old world, it was a painful but accepted part of love and relationships. Now, you are taught that jealousy is a symptom of a diseased, capitalist mindset. It stems from a sense of ownership, the idea that another person is your property. So, if you feel a pang of jealousy seeing your partner talking with someone else, you are now supposed to feel a double shame. First, the sting of the emotion itself, and second, a profound guilt for harboring such a politically incorrect, bourgeois feeling. You are expected to sublimate that possessive instinct into a more productive, comrade-like spirit. It's a strange and fascinating piece of social engineering. The state was just trying to control your actions. It was trying to remap your very emotions. Did it work? That's something historians are still trying to unravel. Did an entire generation truly learn to suppress these fundamental human feelings? Or did they simply learn to hide them better? It's likely that for many, this official doctrine was a public mask. You recited the correct slogans at meetings. You praised the virtues of chastity and comrade-like affection, and then, in whatever sliver of privacy you could find, you tried to live a life that felt Well, human. The state could control the public narrative, but the human heart has always been a stubborn and unruly territory. And in the midst of all this, you might come across a strange little nugget of official advice, perhaps in a youth league pamphlet or a newspaper column. It would explain that the ideal time for a young couple to meet and get to know each other was during a sub-botnik, one of those days of supposedly voluntary and paid labor for the state. The thinking was that you could best judge a person's character by how enthusiastically they dug a ditch or laid bricks for the glorious cause. It's a very Soviet take on a first date. Forget candlelit dinners. The true test of compatibility is your shared zeal for shoveling gravel. It's a funny thought, but it perfectly encapsulates the new ideology. Love wasn't about chemistry or connection. It was about shared political commitment and productive output. The goal of all this was simple: control. A population consumed by private passions is unpredictable, but a population whose entire emotional life is directed toward the state is unified, mobilized, and easier to manage. The party sought to become the ultimate object of desire. It was a grand attempt to drain the color from the private lives of millions, so that all that remained was a stark, uniform, and politically reliable shade of red. The public square was successfully sanitized. Speeches replaced whispers, and marches replaced strolls for two. But life has to be lived somewhere, and you are about to discover that the place you call home will make upholding this austere public facade both absolutely necessary and nearly impossible. The walls of your home, you will soon learn, are very, very thin. The state has re-engineered your public life and your ideological landscape. Now, it's going to re-engineer your home. You receive a notice, a slip of coarse paper with an official stamp. You have been assigned a room, not an apartment, a room. You pack your few belongings, a couple of changes of clothes, a pot, a blanket, your papers, and you make your way to a grand, imposing building. It's a beautiful old pre-revolutionary apartment, maybe one that once belonged to a single wealthy family, with high ceilings and ornate plasterwork, now scarred and faded. You push open the heavy front door and step into a long, dim corridor. The air is thick with the smell of boiling cabbage, damp laundry, and a faint, ever-present scent of dust and human proximity. This is a communalka, a communal apartment, and it will be your home. This is the state's answer to the chronic urban housing shortage. The solution was simple, if brutal. Take these large apartments, partition them, and assign one room to each family or individual. Your room is down the hall. It's small, maybe 10 square meters, with a tall window that looks out onto a grimy courtyard. This is your space, your bedroom, your living room, your study, your entire private world, all contained within these four walls. But you are not alone. You share this apartment with 4, maybe 5 other families, strangers. There is one kitchen for everyone, one bathroom, one toilet. The very concept of privacy, as you once understood it, evaporates the moment you cross the threshold. You quickly learn the geography of this new world. The corridor is the main artery, a perpetually busy thoroughfare of neighbors heading to the kitchen, the bathroom, or out the front door. It's a space of awkward greetings and averted eyes. Then there's the kitchen, the heart of the communalka. It's a chaotic ballet of shared stovetops and jostling elbows. Each family has their own small table, their own shelf, their own designated space, a tiny island of sovereignty in a sea of shared squalor. The bathroom is a place of endless negotiation, with a strict schedule for bathing days that is posted on the door and frequently argued over. The most defining feature of this life, however, is the sound. The walls are paper-thin. They are not just architectural features. They are membranes, transmitting every cough, every argument, every cry of a baby, every secret whisper. You learn the rhythms of your neighbors' lives with an intimacy you never asked for. You know who snores. You know which couple is fighting. You know when the old woman in the next room is listening to the radio. You learn to talk in low voices, to move quietly, to wrap your life in a layer of auditory cotton wool. But it's no use. You hear everything, and you know, with absolute certainty, that they hear everything too. This forced proximity creates a unique and deeply stressful social environment. Any small act of intimacy becomes a public performance. A quiet conversation with a partner is held in hushed tones, straining to keep the words from bleeding through the wall. A touch, a shared moment of tenderness feels fraught, as if you have an invisible audience just on the other side of the plaster. The bedroom door, which in another world might represent a sanctuary, here is just a flimsy barrier. There is no lock that can keep out the sounds, the smells, and the sheer, oppressive presence of other people. This is where the state's ideology of asceticism crashes head first into the grinding reality of daily life. The state tells you to be chaste, to control your desires. But the communalka makes any expression of those desires a logistical nightmare. It's one thing to preach celibacy in a public square. It's another to try and live any kind of private life when you can hear your neighbor clearing his throat as you sit on your own bed. The communalka was, in many ways, the perfect tool for enforcing the new morality. It turned neighbors into unwilling guardians of each other's virtue. It made privacy a scarce and precious commodity, and intimacy an act that required immense planning, courage, and a good sense of timing. Historians debate the true intent behind the communalka. Was it purely a practical, if deeply flawed, solution to a housing crisis, or was there a more insidious ideological purpose at play? The term often used is the socialization of life, the idea that by forcing people into these collective living spaces, the state could break down the bourgeois notion of the private family unit and forge anew collective consciousness. Whether by design or by accident, it achieved something profound. It automatized society while simultaneously forcing people into suffocating closeness. You are never alone, but you might feel lonelier than ever. And as you try to settle into this new life, you start to realize that the thin walls are just the beginning. The real surveillance, the real pressure, comes from the people you share a stove with. The political heart of your new home isn't in your room. It's in the kitchen. The kitchen is not just a place to cook. It is the political bureau of your apartment, the courtroom, and the central node of the gossip-fueled intelligence network that governs your life. Every morning, you navigate this space with the careful diplomacy of an ambassador in a hostile country. Your small patch of counter space, your single gas burner, your shelf for groats and tea, these are your sovereign territories, and any transgression, real or imagined, can spark a conflict that will simmer for weeks. You watch the other residents, learning the unwritten constitution of the communalka. There's Nina Petrovna, a stern widow who seems to have appointed herself the moral guardian of the apartment. Her eyes follow everyone. She comments on the quality of your potatoes, the time you come home at night, the person who visited you last week. She is the gatekeeper of the communal conscience, and her weapon of choice is a well-aimed sigh of disapproval or a pointed remark muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. Then there's the young Komsomol, young Communist League activist, a zealous true believer who sees it as his duty to monitor the political purity of his neighbors. He leaves clippings from Pravda on the shared table about the dangers of bourgeois sentimentality. Life in the kitchen is a masterclass in passive aggression. Did someone use your salt without asking? You don't confront them directly. Instead, you have a loud, philosophical conversation with another neighbor about the decline of basic respect in modern society. Is someone taking too long at the stove when you need to cook? You stand behind them, pot in hand, radiating an aura of impatient martyrdom. These small domestic dramas are the stuff of daily life, but they have a darker undercurrent, because in the Soviet Union, a disgruntled neighbor is not just an annoyance. They are a potential threat. Any private matter, especially one concerning love or relationships, is currency in this environment. A heated argument with your partner, overheard through the wall, can become the subject of a hushed kitchen conference the next morning. A visitor who stays a little too late can spark days of speculation. You learn to read the subtle signals, the sudden silences when you enter the room, the quick, knowing glances exchanged between Nina Petrovna and the activist. Your private life is being dissected, judged, and filed away for future use. This is where the state's control becomes deeply personal. The government doesn't need to place a microphone in every room. It has created a system where the citizens police each other. A neighbor's complaint to the building committee, or, worse, to the party, about antisocial or immoral behavior could have serious consequences. It could mean a visit from a stern official. It could affect your housing situation, your job, even your freedom. The fear of this is a constant, low-level hum in the background of your life. It forces you to project an image of perfect, chaste, and politically upright conduct, even when your inner world is anything but. This constant surveillance had a chilling effect on intimacy. Imagine trying to bring a date home to this environment. It's not just about finding a moment of privacy. It's about running a gauntlet of judging eyes. You walk down the corridor, hyper-aware of the doors that might crack open, of the ears pressed against them. Introducing your guest to this web of communal scrutiny feels like a betrayal of the intimacy you hope to build. As a result, many people's romantic lives were lived almost entirely outdoors, in parks, on benches, in the fleeting anonymity of the city streets. The home, the traditional locus of private life, had become the most public place of all. One of the most peculiar and telling details of this life was the battle for the light bulb. The single light bulb in the corridor or the bathroom was a frequent source of conflict. Who pays for the replacement? Who is using it too much? This simple object became a symbol for all the pent-up frustrations of communal living. Historians have found countless records of official complaints and even neighborhood tribunals convened to solve disputes over a single, burnt-out light bulb. It seems absurd, but it reveals how the pressure of forced cohabitation could magnify the smallest friction into a major crisis. It was never just about the light bulb. It was about fairness, resources, and the constant, grinding stress of having no space to call your own. The kitchen, with its simmering pots and simmering resentments, teaches you the most important lesson of Soviet life. The line between the personal and the political has been erased. Your choice of romantic partner, the frequency of their visits, the volume of your arguments, it's all potentially political. The state's ideology of asceticism was just enforced from the top down. It was enforced from the side by the very people you shared a bathroom with. It created a society where everyone was a potential warden, and every home was a tiny, transparent prison. And in this prison, even the simplest act of courtship had to be completely reinvented. So, your home life is a panopticon of judging neighbors. The official ideology frowns upon frivolous romance. How, then, do you even attempt to date? You have to learn the art of the Soviet-style courtship, a ritual defined by scarcity, a scarcity of privacy, a scarcity of places to go, and a scarcity of acceptable ways to express affection. Forget the spontaneous, let's grab a coffee kind of date. Cafes and restaurants are few, expensive, and often require reservations or long waits. Besides, sitting in such a public place feels too much like an interrogation under the bright, state-owned chandeliers. So, the primary theater for romance is the great outdoors. The most common date is a walk. A long, meandering walk through one of the city's vast, manicured parks. Gorky Park in Moscow, for example. You meet your potential partner, perhaps someone you know from work or university class, near a designated metro station. The conversation is stilted at first. You talk about the weather. You talk about the latest production figures from the newspaper. You discuss the film you both saw all last week at the local cinema, one of the few approved forms of entertainment. The film itself was likely a stirring tale of collective farm workers exceeding their quota or heroic soldiers defending the motherland. So your review of it is also a performance of your political reliability. The tractor scene was particularly inspiring, don't you think? As you walk, you maintain a respectable distance. Public displays of affection are deeply frowned upon. Holding hands is a bold move, reserved for couples who are practically engaged. A kiss on the cheek is scandalous. You see older, more conservative citizens, the self-appointed guardians of public morality, purse their lips in disapproval at any couple that gets too close. So you communicate through conversation. through glances, through the shared experience of walking past the same statues and flowers. The park is your sanctuary. It offers a kind of anonymous intimacy. You can sit on a bench, slightly separated, and talk for hours, here, away from the thin walls of the communal. You can finally have a conversation that feels your own. You might even dare to talk about something personal, your family, your dreams, your frustrations, but always in coded language, always with a glance over your shoulder. The fear of being overheard by the wrong person is never far away. What do you talk about for hours on end? Often, poetry. In a society where direct emotional expression was suspect, poetry became a vital outlet. You might recite Pushkin or Lermontov from memory. Quoting these classic poets was a safe way to talk about love, passion, and longing without having to use your own, more dangerous, words. The poet's feelings became a stand-in for your own. It was a shared cultural language that allowed for a deep emotional connection without explicitly breaking the rules. Historians still debate the true nature of these public courtships. Were they really as chaste and intellectual as they appeared? Or was this public performance just the first act? For many, the answer is the latter. This public ritual was a necessary screening process. After weeks of these chaste walks and poetic recitations, if the connection deepened, the real challenge began, finding a place to be truly alone. This led to a desperate search for privacy, what the Russians called finding an UGOL, a corner. It could be an empty office after hours, a friend's room when they were away for the weekend, or, in the summer, a secluded spot in the woods outside the city. The entire romantic life of a generation was built around this relentless, exhausting hunt for a private corner. In this landscape of scarcity, you learn about a very peculiar and uniquely Soviet dating phenomenon, the telephone romance. In many communales, there was only one telephone for the entire apartment, located in the hallway. It was a public utility, and every call was, by definition, a public event. So, a young man might call a young woman, and their entire conversation would be conducted with an audience of neighbors, pretending to be busy but listening to every word. This led to the development of an incredibly elaborate and coded form of speech. I was just walking past the library and thought of that book we discussed could mean I miss you. Perhaps we could review the production figures together on Saturday could be an invitation for a walk. It was a romance conducted in bureaucratic code, a testament to the human ability to adapt and find connection even in the most impossible circumstances. This entire process was slow, deliberate, and fraught with anxiety. It was a world away from the glass of water fantasy of the early revolution. Love wasn't easy or simple. It was a complex logistical problem, a test of patience and ingenuity. You had to navigate the public performance of the chaste walk, the intellectual bonding over poetry, the coded language of the communal telephone, and the constant, draining search for a private corner. And even if you succeeded in all of this, you would soon face another, even more formidable obstacle, one that lived at the very intersection of state ideology and personal biology. The almost complete absence of reliable contraception. You have navigated the public courtship, the coded conversations, and the desperate search for a private corner. You found a moment of intimacy, a fragile bubble of privacy in a world designed to eliminate it. But now you and your partner are confronted by a new and formidable reality, a consequence that the state, in its wisdom, has made both terrifyingly likely and incredibly difficult to manage. This is the reality of Soviet contraception, or, more accurately, the lack thereof. The official ideology was prone at a list. The state wanted more workers, more soldiers, more citizens to populate its vast territories. From the government's perspective, contraception was a tool that thwarted this goal. Therefore, producing and distributing it was never a priority. The result was a chronic, system-wide shortage of even the most basic forms of birth control. What was available was often of such laughably poor quality that it became the subject of grim, cynical jokes. Let's talk about the infamous rubber product number 2, Azit Eliye no Merdivier. This was the official name for the state-produced Soviet condom. The name itself tells you a lot. It's not a brand name. It's a bureaucratic designation, like a type of screw or a grade of steel. There was no rubber product number 1, a fact that led to endless speculation. Was it a gas mask? A gouache? The mystery was part of the folklore. What was the mystery was the quality. These condoms were made from thick, coarse rubber, oft unpurely manufactured, and were notorious for their unreliability. They were individually packaged in drab paper envelopes with stark, clinical lettering. Buying them was an exercise in public humiliation, requiring you to ask a stern-faced pharmacist for product number 2 while other customers listened in. For women, the options were even more limited and grim. Diaphragms were practically unheard of. The birth control pill, which revolutionized sexual norms in the West in the 1960s, was simply not available in the Soviet Union for decades. When it finally appeared in a limited capacity, it was often the early, high-dose versions that had been discontinued in the West due to severe side effects. They were viewed with deep suspicion by both doctors and the general public. So what did people do? They relied on methods that were as old as the villages their parents had come from. The rhythm method, withdrawal, and a host of folk remedies passed down from grandmothers. People used lemon juice, douching with various household substances, or other scientifically baseless techniques out of sheer desperation. It was a game of Russian roulette, where the stakes were life-altering. This scarcity of contraception is one of the great paradoxes of the Soviet system. The state promoted a puritanical, ascetic ideology, demanding that its citizens control their desires. Yet, it simultaneously denied them the most effective tools to manage the consequences of those desires. It was a system that set people up for failure. It created a constant, low-level anxiety that permeated every intimate relationship. Every act of love was shadowed by the fear of an unwanted pregnancy. This leads to a fascinating, if bleak, academic debate. Was this contraceptive scarcity a result of simple bureaucratic incompetence and misplaced priorities, or was it a deliberate policy? Some historians argue that the Soviet command economy was just notoriously bad at producing consumer goods of any kind, and condoms were no exception. The focus was always on heavy industry, steel, tanks, tractors, not on flimsy pieces of rubber. Others suggest them were cynical, prone at a list motive. They argue that the state understood that by making contraception difficult to obtain, it would inevitably lead to more pregnancies, helping to boost the population. The truth, as is often the case with the Soviet Union, is likely a messy combination of both. A system that was ideologically inclined to discourage birth, control and bureaucratically incapable of producing it effectively anyway. In this landscape of make do and hope for the best, you hear about a strange, almost mythical item whispered about on the black market. A foreign-made condom. A sailor who's been to a western port, a foreign student, or a diplomat might smuggle in a small supply. These were treated like precious jewels. A single, brightly packaged western condom could be a status symbol, an object of incredible value and desire. It was just a piece of latex. It was a symbol of quality, reliability, and a world of carefree modernity that was utterly inaccessible. It represented a freedom from fear that was, for most, completely unimaginable. This constant anxiety, this background fear, had a profound impact on relationships. It could create a sense of shared adversity, a feeling of us against the system, but it could also create tension and resentment. The burden of prevention and the consequences of failure fell disproportionately on women. In a world with few reliable options, the biological reality of reproduction could not be ignored, and when these unreliable methods inevitably failed, women were left facing a stark choice, one that would lead them to another, even more harrowing part of the Soviet healthcare system: the failure of product number to lead directly to what became, for millions of women, the primary form of birth control, abortion. And for a brief, shining moment at the dawn of the Soviet state, that option was not only available, but a revolutionary right. Before the fear, Before the back alleys and the whispered transactions, there was a moment of stunning, revolutionary change. Let's rewind the clock again. Back to 1920. The Civil War is still raging. The new Soviet state is fighting for its very survival, and in the midst of this chaos, on November 18th, the government issues a decree that reverberates around the world. It is the decree on the legalization of abortions. Just like that, Soviet Russia becomes the first country on the planet to legalize abortion on demand, available to all women, free of charge in state hospitals. Imagine the impact of this. In the rest of the world, abortion is a crime, a moral sin, a dangerous procedure performed in secret. But here, in this new, nascent worker state, it is declared a woman's right. The logic behind this decree was complex, and it's a subject historians still unpack with great interest. It was framed in the language of individual choice or bodily autonomy that we might use today. The reasoning was a pragmatic and ideological blend, uniquely Soviet. The decree itself states that the old laws against abortion were a product of the bourgeois state, designed to force women into childbirth regardless of their circumstances, turning them into little more than breeding machines. The preamble acknowledges that the moral survivals of the past and the difficult economic conditions of the present still compel many women to undergo the procedure. Therefore, the state argued, the only way to protect women's health was to take abortion out of the shadows and bring it into the clean, safe environment of the hospital. The ultimate goal, the decree stated, was a future communist society where the social and economic causes of abortion would disappear, and the procedure would become unnecessary. But until that utopian future arrived, it was the state's duty to provide it safely. You are a young woman in Moscow or Petrograd in the early 1922. Perhaps you are a factory worker, living in a crowded dormitory. An unplanned pregnancy would be a personal catastrophe, likely meaning the loss of your job and your independence. This new law is not an abstract political statement. It is a lifeline. It means you have a measure of control over your destiny that your mother or grandmother could never have dreamed of. It is a tangible piece of liberation, a promise that the revolution is not just for men. This policy was also championed by the ZHNL, the women's department of the Communist Party, led by figures like Alexandra Kollontai and Inessa Herman. They saw the legalization of abortion as a crucial step in the emancipation of women. It was part of a larger package of revolutionary family reforms that included simplified divorce, the recognition of illegitimate children, and the theoretical promise of communal kitchens and laundries to free women from domestic drudgery. For a time, it seemed that the Soviet state was genuinely committed to creating a new kind of gender equality. However, the reality on the ground was often more complicated than the revolutionary ideal. While the procedure was legal and free, the healthcare system was overwhelmed and under-resourced. Hospitals were crowded. Anesthesia was often unavailable. The techniques used were, by today's standards, quite harsh. A woman seeking an abortion would often have to go before a commission to have her case approved, and the process, while legal, could still feel intrusive and judgmental. And there was a curious, almost paradoxical side effect of this policy. Because contraception remained so scarce and unreliable, abortion quickly became the default method of birth control. It was a last resort. For many, it was the primary resort. This led to astonishingly high rates of abortion, with many women undergoing the procedure multiple times throughout their reproductive years. This is a point of ongoing scholarly discussion. Did the easy availability of abortion inadvertently disenfranchise the state from ever developing a proper contraceptive industry? It's a chicken and egg problem. Some argue that the reliance on abortion was a direct result of the lack of contraception. Others suggest that once the state had a solution to unwanted pregnancies, however brutal, the impetus to invest in preventative measures was lost. It was seen as a problem already solved. You might even hear a strange term being used by doctors and health officials at the time. Abortion culture. It wasn't meant in a positive way. It was a term of concern, describing a society that had become, out of necessity, reliant on a surgical procedure to do the work that contraception should have been doing. Doctors wrote articles expressing alarm at the number of repeat abortions and the potential long-term health consequences for women. So, this period of legal abortion was not a simple feminist utopia. It was a complex, contradictory policy born of revolutionary ideals and harsh realities. It granted women a level of control over their bodies that was unprecedented, but it did so within a system that offered them few other choices. It was a radical solution to a problem that the state itself was helping to create, and this fragile, hard-won right, this beacon of revolutionary modernity, was living on borrowed time. The ideological winds were shifting again. The man of steel, Joseph Stalin, was consolidating his power, and he had very different ideas about a woman's duty to the state. The brief dawn of reproductive freedom was about to be plunged into a long, dark night. The year is 1936. The relative chaos and ideological experimentation of the 1920s are a distant memory. The country is now firmly in the grip of Stalin's will. The 5-year plans are transforming the nation at a brutal pace, and the Great Purge is beginning to cast its terrifying shadow. The state requires more of everything. More steel, more grain, and above all, more people. The low birth rate, a consequence of years of social upheaval, war, and the widespread use of abortion, is now viewed not as a social issue, but as a threat to national security. One morning, you pick up a copy of Pravda, and the headline shocks you. The decree in defense of mother and child has been announced. With the stroke of a pen, the 1920 law is overturned. Abortion is once again illegal. The public justification for this dramatic reversal is cloaked in the language of protecting women's health and celebrating the joys of motherhood. The state media is flooded with articles and editorials. They argue that the Soviet Union has now achieved such a level of socialist prosperity that the original reasons for legal abortion, poverty and survivals of the past, no longer exist. To seek an abortion now, in this new, happy, and prosperous society, is presented as an act of profound selfishness and anti-Soviet sentiment. The state has provided crèches, kindergartens, and financial support. What more could a woman want? To refuse motherhood now is to refuse your patriotic duty. The law is swift and harsh. Performing an abortion is now a crime punishable by prison time for the doctor. A woman who seeks one faces public censure, fines, and social shame. The only exceptions are for cases where the pregnancy poses a direct threat to the woman's life. The message from the state is unambiguous. Your womb is now an instrument of national policy. This is the beginning of what historians call the Great Retreat. The revolutionary family policies of the 1920s are systematically dismantled. Divorce is made much more difficult and expensive. The state begins a massive propaganda campaign to glorify the traditional family unit, a strong father, a fertile mother, and a multitude of happy, healthy children. And at the heart of this campaign is a new, powerful symbol, the mother heroine. This is an official title, an award created by the state to honor women who have 10 or more children. It is the highest honor a civilian woman can receive, equivalent to the hero of the Soviet Union for a soldier. If you have 9 children, you receive the Order of Maternal Glory, first class. 7 or 8 get you the second class. 5 or 6 children earn you the Medal of Motherhood. You see the pictures of these mother heroines everywhere. They are in the newspapers and on posters. They are usually depicted as stout, smiling, peasant women, often surrounded by a flock of beaming, rosy-cheeked children. They are portrayed as national treasures. They are given public ceremonies, financial stipends, and better housing allocations. They are the new ideal of Soviet womanhood, selfless, fertile, and utterly devoted to the state's demographic goals. This cult of fertility creates an immense social pressure. Your worth as a woman is now explicitly tied to your reproductive capacity. In your communalka, in your workplace, the questions start. When are you going to have a child for the motherland? If you are married and childless, you are viewed with suspicion, even pity. You might be seen as selfish. or perhaps medically defective, the pressure is relentless. But there's a strange and often overlooked detail within this new legal framework. While the state made abortion illegal, it also introduced a new financial measure, a special tax on childless individuals and small families. If you were a man between the ages of 20 and 50, or a married woman between 20 and 45, and you had no children, you were required to pay an extra 6% of your income to the state. It was, in effect, a tax on being infertile, single, or simply not wanting children. Historians are still assessing the true impact of this tax. Did it actually encourage people to have more children, or did it just create another layer of financial hardship and resentment in an already difficult life? For many, it felt less like an incentive and more like a punishment, a monthly fine for failing to fulfill their demographic duty. The state's campaign was a masterclass in social engineering, using a combination of criminalization, propaganda, and financial incentives to push the population in a specific direction. On the surface, it seemed to work. The birth rate did tick upwards for a while. The state celebrated this as a triumph of socialist policy. But beneath the surface, a different, more desperate story was unfolding. The state had banned abortion, but it had not banned unwanted pregnancies. The demand for a way out did not disappear. It just went underground. The government's attempt to create a generation of mother heroines also created a thriving, dangerous black market, where women, faced with an impossible choice, would risk their health, their freedom, and their lives on a kitchen table. The 1936 ban has slammed the door on legal, safe abortions, but the reality of life in the Soviet Union, the crowded communal chaos, the food shortages, the sheer difficulty of raising a child in such a precarious world, has not changed. An unwanted pregnancy is still a personal crisis, but now it's one that pushes women outside the law and into a terrifying underworld of risk and desperation. The state may have made its decree, but the human need to control one's destiny is a powerful force. The official hospitals will no longer help you, so where do you turn? You begin by asking a friend, in a hushed, fearful whisper, and that friend might know another friend, who knows a woman, who knows where to go. The information travels through these secret, informal networks, passed from one woman to another like a dangerous secret. This is how you find the babka, the granny or wise woman. She might be an older woman in a nearby village who still remembers pre-revolutionary folk remedies. Or, more often, she is someone with a shred of medical knowledge, a disgraced former midwife, a nurse's aide, or even a cleaner who worked in a hospital and watched the procedures. They operate out of their own homes, most commonly in their kitchens. The kitchen table, the center of family life in the communalka, is transformed into a makeshift, unsterile operating table. Imagine the scene. You arrive at a dingy apartment, clutching a small bundle of cash, or perhaps a bottle of vodka or some food as payment. The air is thick with the smell of boiled herbs and disinfectant, a futile attempt to mask the lack of proper sanitation. The babka is a grim, practical figure. There is no comfort here, only a hurried, clandestine transaction. The instruments she uses are terrifyingly crude: a knitting needle, a wire coat hanger, a bicycle spoke, or perhaps a catheter bought on the black market. They are likely not sterilized, perhaps just wiped down with alcohol or boiled in the same pot used for cooking supper. There is no anesthesia. The pain is excruciating, something you must endure in silence, biting down on a rag to keep from screaming and alerting the neighbors. The risk of infection is immense. Sepsis, hemorrhage, and perforation of the uterus are common. Many women leave these kitchen tables with life-altering injuries, permanent infertility, or chronic pain, and many do not leave at all. This is the grim reality behind Stalin's prone at a list utopia. For every smiling mother heroine on a poster, there were countless anonymous women taking this terrifying gamble. The state, in its attempt to control demography, had created a public health catastrophe. Unofficial statistics, pieced together by historians from hospital records of women admitted with complications, paint a horrifying picture. The number of deaths and injuries from these illegal procedures skyrocketed. It became a leading cause of female mortality. This raises a stark question that historians continue to debate. Did the Soviet authorities, on some level, know the extent of this catastrophe? The evidence suggests they did. The state-run hospitals were flooded with women suffering from the botched results of these underground operations. Doctors knew exactly what they were seeing, even if they had to record it in euphemistic terms like post-abortion sepsis. Yet, for nearly 2 decades, the state refused to change the law. The ideological commitment to population growth and the refusal to admit that the happy, prosperous socialist society still produced conditions where women would risk death to avoid childbirth was stronger than the undeniable medical reality. The official silence was deafening. In this grim landscape, a strange and specific piece of slang emerged. The illegal abortion was sometimes referred to as going to see the musician, and the instrument used was the clarinet. This dark, cynical humor was a coping mechanism, a way of speaking about the unspeakable. It was a code that allowed women to communicate their shared trauma without using the explicit, dangerous words. It's a small, chilling detail that reveals a world of hidden suffering. You might even see the aftermath of this system firsthand. A neighbor in your communalka is suddenly taken ill. She has a raging fever. She is weak and delirious. An ambulance is called in the middle of the night. The neighbors watch from their doorways, whispering. Everyone knows what has likely happened, but no one says the word. The woman might return from the hospital weeks later, pale and changed, or she might not return at all. And the next day, life in the kitchen, with its simmering resentments and enforced cheerfulness, goes on as if nothing has happened. The ban created a world of fear, silence, and immense solidarity among women, who had to rely on each other to navigate a system that was actively hostile to their well-being. But this was not the only aspect of private life that the state sought to criminalize. Another law, equally ideological and even more brutal in its enforcement, was aimed not at women, but at a specific group of men, forcing them into an even deeper, more terrified silence. While the state was busy trying to engineer heterosexual relationships to serve its demographic goals, it was simultaneously engaged in a far more brutal campaign of eradication against a form of love it deemed utterly alien and hostile to the Soviet project. This campaign was codified in a single, terrifying line in the Criminal Code, Article 121. Let's be clear about what this was. In 1934, just 2 years before the abortion ban, the Soviet state recriminalized male homosexuality. The law was blunt and unforgiving. It prescribed a sentence of up to 5 years of hard labor in the Gulag for sexual acts between men. For acts involving force, dependence, or the abuse of a position of power, the sentence was even longer. This was a shocking reversal. After the 1917 revolution, the old terrorist laws criminalizing homosexuality had been wiped from the books, along with the rest of the old legal code. For a brief period, what consenting adults did in private was not a state matter. But under Stalin, this changed dramatically. The new law was introduced suddenly, with no public debate. It was presented as a necessary measure to protect society from a corrupting influence. The official justification, as laid out in letters by Maxim Gorky and in secret police documents, was a toxic brew of political paranoia and crude prejudice. Homosexuality was officially branded a fascist perversion. It was depicted as a decadent, bourgeois act, a sign of the moral decay of the capitalist West. The logic, as twisted as it was, went something like this. Fascism was the ultimate expression of bourgeois decay. Homosexuality was a feature of that decay. Therefore, homosexuals were potential fifth columnists, spies, and counter-revolutionaries. They were seen as part of a degenerate international conspiracy to undermine the healthy, masculine, proletarian Soviet state. Imagine you are a man who loves other men in this new environment. Your very existence has just been declared a crime against the state, a political threat. Fear becomes the air you breathe. You are forced to live a life of constant, vigilant secrecy. Every gesture, every friendship, Every word you speak is now scrutinized through a new, dangerous lens. A close bond with another man, once a source of comfort, is now a potential liability, a piece of evidence that could be used against you. The enforcement of Article 121 was swift and brutal. The NKVD, the secret police, began actively hunting for gay men. They used informants, entrapment, and surveillance. They would raid known cruising spots, like certain parks or public baths. They would intercept letters. They would interrogate suspects, using psychological pressure and sometimes physical force to extract confessions and, most importantly, the names of others. This created a domino effect of arrests, tearing through social circles and destroying lives. An arrest was a social and personal death sentence, even before the trial. The charge itself was so shameful, so un-Soviet, that you would be instantly ostracized. Your family might disown you. You would be expelled from the Communist Party, fired from your job, and publicly denounced as a degenerate. Your name would be dragged through the mud. Then came the trial, a brief, perfunctory affair where guilt was a foregone conclusion. And then, the Gulag. You would be sent to a labor camp, where you would face not only the brutal conditions of starvation and overwork, but also the extreme prejudice of both the guards and the other prisoners, for whom the charge of pederasty was the lowest of the low. This creates a fascinating and tragic question for historians. Why was lesbianism not included in Article 121? Female homosexuality was never explicitly criminalized in the same way. The reasons for this are still debated. Some scholars suggest it was a matter of pure misogyny. The state was so male-centric that it simply couldn't conceive of female sexuality existing independently of men. It was seen as a less serious, almost juvenile phenomenon. Others argue that the law was primarily about enforcing a specific model of masculine, proletarian strength, and lesbians, while perhaps seen as deviant, did not pose the same ideological threat to this model. Whatever the reason, this legal disparity created two very different, though equally difficult, realities for gay men and women. One of the most chilling aspects of Article 121 was how it was used as a political tool. The accusation of homosexuality became a convenient way to eliminate a political rival, a troublesome artist, or anyone who didn't fit the mold. It was a charge that was almost impossible to disprove and so stigmatizing that it would instantly neutralize the target. We know from archival records that many prominent figures in the arts and sciences were arrested under this article. The famous, though perhaps apocryphal, story tells of Stalin being shown a list of suspected homosexuals in the Bolshoi ballet. His supposed response was to simply say, "Leave them, we need them to dance." This anecdote, true or not, highlights the cynical and arbitrary nature of the persecution. It wasn't about morality. It was about power and control. Article 121 cast a long, dark shadow over Soviet life for decades. It forced generations of men into a life of profound isolation and fear. It turned love into a crime and intimacy into a conspiracy. It was the ultimate expression of the state's desire to control not just the bodies, but the very souls of its citizens. And just like those seeking illegal abortions, those targeted by this law had to create their own secret world to survive, a fragile network of codes and hidden places where they could, for a fleeting moment, be themselves. You are living under the shadow of Article 121. The state has declared your identity a crime. To survive, you must become invisible. You must master the art of the double life, presenting a flawless facade of conformity to the world while your true self is pushed deep underground. But no one can live in complete isolation. You need connection. You need community, however fragile and dangerous that may be. So, you learn the language of the invisible, the secret geography and decoded dialect of what was known as the Goluboy or light blue world. Goluboy was the slang term for a gay man. It's a strangely poetic and gentle term, a stark contrast to the harsh, clinical pederast used in official documents. Its origin is debated by linguists and historians. Some say it comes from the romantic association of the color blue with dreams in the heavens. Others suggest a more obscure literary or theatrical origin. Whatever its source, it became the insider's term, a way of identifying oneself and others without using the language of the persecutor. To be light blue was to be part of this hidden world. So how do you find other light blue people? You can't put an ad in the paper. You can't ask directly. The risk of entrapment by a plainclothes policeman or an informant is too high. Instead, you learn to navigate a secret map of the city, a network of specific locations where men who knew to go. These were the cruising grounds, the Plus HKA. It might be a particular public park, often near a theater or a central square. The area around the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow was a famous spot for decades. It could be a specific public restroom, a certain bench, or a section of a steam bath banya. These places were not marked on any map, but the knowledge was passed down through whispers, through careful observation, through the subtle but unmistakable signals exchanged between those who were looking for the same thing. You learn the codes, a lingering gaze, a particular way of holding a cigarette, a book held in a certain way. These were the tiny, almost imperceptible signals that could open a door into the secret world. It was a silent conversation, a delicate dance of risk and recognition. You would walk through the park, your senses on high alert, looking for the flicker of an eye. This subtle nod, it said, I see you. You are safe with me. A mistake could mean arrest in the gulag. But the need for human connection was so strong that you took the risk, even within this hidden community. Paranoia was a constant companion. How could you be sure the person you were talking to was genuine? How did you know they weren't an informant trying to meet a quota? Trust was a precious and fragile commodity. People often used fake names and invented elaborate backstories. They would talk for hours, circling around the topic, dropping subtle hints, testing the waters before revealing anything about their true selves. This process of cautious vetting was a crucial survival skill, a fascinating cold case in Soviet history that scholars still ponder is the story of the gay and cave ED rings. There are documented cases from the archives of groups of high-ranking officials, even members of the secret police themselves, who were arrested and purged for being part of homosexual circles. This presents a bewildering paradox. The very men tasked with enforcing Article 121 were sometimes secretly part of the world they were supposed to be destroying. Were these genuine cases? Or were the charges fabricated as part of internal power struggles? It's likely a combination of both, a testament to the fact that no corner of Soviet society, not even its most feared institutions, was immune to the complexities of human desire. In this atmosphere of fear, you might stumble upon a very specific and poignant piece of underground culture, the secret poetry of Mikhail Kuzmin. Kuzmin was a poet from the pre-revolutionary Silver Age, who wrote openly and beautifully about same-sex love in his collection Wings. His work was, of course, banned and suppressed in the Soviet era, but his poems were secretly memorized, copied by hand into notebooks, and passed from person to person. To be able to recite a line from Kuzmin was a powerful signal, a way of saying, I am one of you. I know our history. I know our language. It was a cultural touchstone, a thread of continuity connecting them back to a time before the fear. This hidden world was a testament to human resilience. It was a community built on whispers and glances, in the shadows of public monuments and the steam of public baths. It was a network of incredible bravery and profound tragedy. The men who navigated this world were not political dissidents in the traditional sense. They weren't trying to overthrow the state. They were simply trying to live and love in a system that had criminalized their existence. They created a fragile, secret culture of their own, a light blue archipelago within the vast, monolithic red of the Soviet Empire, and the constant threat that held this world together and threatened to tear it apart came not just from the state, but from the person right next to you. The fear doesn't just come from the top down, from the uniformed officer or the shadowy state agent. In the Soviet Union, the most insidious and unpredictable threat often comes from the side. It comes from the people you see every day, your colleagues at the factory, your fellow students in the lecture hall, and, most terrifyingly, your neighbors in the communalka. This is the world of the do NOS, the anonymous denunciation. and the culture of the Stuka-Ch. The informant. The state actively encouraged this. It was presented as a civic duty, a mark of a vigilant, unpolitically conscious citizen. Posters and newspaper articles celebrated those who exposed enemies of the people, wreckers, and social parasites. Children were taught in school to be watchful, even of their own parents. This created a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion that poisoned the very wellsprings of trust in society. Anyone, for any reason, could write a letter to the authorities, and people did, for a multitude of reasons. Some were true believers, fervent communists who genuinely saw it as their duty to report any perceived deviation from the party line. Others did it out of envy, to settle a personal score, or to gain a material advantage. This is where private life became so dangerous. Your neighbor in the next room, who coveted your slightly larger living space or was angry about your turn in the kitchen, could write it enunciation. The letter might accuse you of telling an anti-Soviet joke, of listening to foreign radio broadcasts, or, most damningly, of immoral behavior. Imagine the psychological toll you are constantly performing, constantly self-censoring. You learn to have two faces, the public face, which is cheerful, optimistic, and orthodox, and the private face, which is shown only to your most trusted intimates. If you have any, a simple complaint about the long queues for bread, if spoken to the wrong person, could be twisted into anti-Soviet agitation. A passionate argument with your partner, overheard through the wall, could be reported as disruptive and bourgeois. This system was particularly devastating for those trying to conduct any kind of secret love life. For a game and living under the threat of Article 121, the jilted lover or blackmailing acquaintance was a mortal threat. A single letter could destroy your life. Many arrests under Article 121 began not with police surveillance, but with a DUNOS from a civilian. This forced people into even deeper layers of secrecy and isolation, making it incredibly difficult to form trusting relationships. For a woman seeking an illegal abortion, the threat was just as real. A neighbor who saw her go to the Babka's apartment, or who noticed her sudden illness, could report her. The fear of this kept many women from even seeking post-abortion medical care when complications arose, often with fatal consequences. They preferred to risk dying in silence rather than face the public shame and legal repercussions of a denunciation. Historians digging through the KGB archives have found mountains of these letters. It's a chilling window into the soul of a society at war with itself. The letters are a mix of ideological fervor, petty jealousy, and desperate self-preservation. One of the most debated topics among scholars is how to interpret this phenomenon. Was this a sign of the totalitarian state's total success in tamizing its citizenry, or was it a more complex story of people using the state's tools for their own private ends? Some argue that it shows a population that had internalized the state's paranoia. Others contend that many people were not true believers, but were cynically manipulating the system for personal gain. A new apartment, a promotion at work, revenge. The truth is probably that both were happening at once, creating a toxic, unpredictable social fabric. In this environment, you might encounter a very particular unsad figure, the public-spirited neighbor who makes it their business to know everyone's business. This is Nina Petrovna from the Communalka kitchen, but magnified to a terrifying degree. She listens at doors. She interrogates your visitors. She keeps a mental ledger of your comings and goings. You try to be polite to her, to keep her on your side, but you live in constant fear of her pen. Her bar comes not from any official position, but from her perceived access to the authorities, her willingness to write that letter. A particularly strange and little-known aspect of this was the phenomenon of preventative denunciations. Sometimes, if you felt you were under suspicion or had done something risky, you might write a denunciation against someone else, a colleague, a neighbor, to prove your own loyalty and vigilance. It was a kind of preemptive strike, a way to deflect attention from yourself by throwing someone else under the bus. It was a moral calculus that only a system like this could produce. This culture of surveillance, both official and informal, was perhaps the state's most effective tool in controlling the private lives of its citizens. It didn't just make forbidden acts dangerous, it made trust itself a rare and dangerous commodity. It forced people to build walls not just around their homes, but around their hearts. And yet, even in this climate of fear, people still fell in love, still had secrets, and still felt the need to talk about their most intimate problems. And sometimes, in a move of stunning naivety or utter desperation, they would write a letter not to denounce someone else, but to seek guidance from the one entity they believed had all the answers. The party itself. In a world where neighbors are potential informants and psychiatrists are practically non-existent, where do you turn with the unmanageable burdens of your heart? In an act of what seems today like either incredible faith or profound desperation, many Soviet citizens turned to the ultimate authority on all matters, from industrial production to the human soul, the Communist Party. They wrote letters. These weren't denunciations. They were heartfelt, deeply personal, and often painfully naive letters sent to the editors of major newspapers, like Pravda or Izvestia, or to local party committees. People wrote seeking advice on the most intimate aspects of their lives: love, marriage, jealousy, and sexual frustration. The party, having positioned itself as the arbiter of all truth and the shepherd of the new Soviet person, became, for many, a kind of secular priest or a national advice columnist. Imagine you are a young man, deeply in love with a woman who doesn't seem to share your revolutionary zeal. You are torn. Your heart tells you one thing, but your communal training tells you another. So you sit down under a dim light bulb in your communal room and carefully draft a letter to the editor. Dear comrade editor, you begin, I am in love with a woman who is wonderful in many ways, but she prefers bourgeois dancing to attending political lectures. Is it possible to build a strong, socialist family with such a person? What is my duty as a communist? Or perhaps you are a young woman, married to a man who is cold and unaffectionate. The state tells you that divorce is a sign of social instability, a failure. So you write, my husband and I live like strangers under one roof. There is no comradely warmth between us. Is this the model of a Soviet family? How can I inspire him to be a better husband and a better communist? These letters, thousands of which are now preserved in state archives, provide an extraordinary glimpse into the private anxieties of a generation trying to reconcile their innate human feelings with a rigid and unforgiving ideology. They are trying, with agonizing sincerity, to be good. They have been told there is a correct way to love, to marry, to feel. They are just trying to figure out what that is. The responses, when they were published, were just as fascinating. The newspaper editors or party officials would answer these cries from the heart with a barrage of ideological jargon. The young man worried about his girlfriend's love for dancing would be advised to patiently re-educate her, to show her the superior joy of collective labor and political consciousness. The woman in the loveless marriage would be told to examine her own behavior first, to see if she was being a sufficiently supportive and inspiring comrade to her husband. The solutions were always political. The answer to a broken heart was to have a stronger commitment to the 5-year plan. This is a subject that fascinates many social historians. What does this letter-writing phenomenon tell us about the relationship between the state and the individual? On one hand, it can be seen as a sign of the total success of state indoctrination. People had so thoroughly internalized the party's authority that they genuinely believed it held the key to their personal happiness. They saw their private lives through a political lens. On the other hand, it can be seen as an act of quiet resistance. In a world with no other outlet, writing a letter was a way to make their private suffering visible, to demand that the system acknowledge their humanity, even if they had to frame it in the system's own language. This debate about internationalization versus strategic adaptation is ongoing. One of the most poignant and bizarre categories of these letters involves sexual problems. Given the lack of any real sex education, people were grappling with fundamental questions in a state of profound ignorance. A man might write to a newspaper complaining of his wife's frigidity, asking for the party's advice on how to awaken her sense of marital duty. These letters would sometimes be answered by doctors in the official press, but always in a dry, clinical, and completely desexualized manner. The advice would focus on proper hygiene, healthy diet, and getting enough exercise, as if a brisk walk was the cure for a lack of intimacy. A particularly telling detail is that many of these letters were written anonymously, signed with things like a confused consumal member or a worried wife. This anonymity speaks volumes. It shows that even as they were turning to the state for help, they were still terrified of the consequences of revealing their personal failures. They believed in the party's wisdom, but they didn't trust it with their names. This strange, one-way conversation between the people and the party highlights the immense gap between the official image of Soviet life and the messy reality. While the state was busy projecting an image of strong, healthy, and ideologically pure citizens, the citizens themselves were secretly writing letters, asking how to cope with loneliness, heartbreak, and unrequited love. They were trying to fit their roundly human pegs into the square holes of Soviet ideology. And as they wrote these letters, seeking guidance on how to live up to the ideal, the state was busy creating the very posters that made that ideal seem so effortlessly and so impossibly real, while ordinary people were wrestling with their messy, complicated private lives. The state was busy crafting a perfect, sanitized version of reality. This was the world of the propaganda poster, a world of heroic ideals and flawless socialist archetypes. And in this world, the Soviet couple was a very specific and powerful symbol. You see them everywhere, on billboards, in factory canteens, in school hallways. They are the model Soviet family, the image you are supposed to emulate, but they don't look like anyone you actually know. The man is broad-shouldered and square-jawed, his muscles straining against his clean work shirt. He holds a tool, the wrench, the gear, the hammer, with a look of intense, patriotic focus. The woman is strong and healthy, her hair tied back in a practical scarf. She is often depicted in work clothes as well, perhaps driving a tractor or holding a sheaf of wheat. She is his equal partner in labor. What is most striking about these images is what's missing. There is no softness, no romance, no hint of the private, tender world of a couple. They are rarely looking at each other. If their eyes meet, it's with a look of shared comrade-like determination, not affection, nor often. They are both looking forward, in the same direction, towards the glowing future of communism. Their hands might be close, but they are more likely to be resting on a piece of machinery than on each other. Their children, if depicted, are equally idealized. They are rosy-cheeked, perfectly behaved, and often wearing the red kerchief of the young pioneers. They are not shown throwing tantrums or making a mess. They are shown learning, contributing, and preparing to become the next generation of model Soviet citizens. The entire family unit is presented as a small, efficient production team dedicated to the goals of the state. This imagery was a deliberate and carefully constructed part of the state's ideological project. After the Great Retreat from the experimental 19-20 seconds, the family was race-entered as the core unit of society. But it was a very specific kind of family. It was not a refuge from the state, but an extension of it. The purpose of the family was to produce loyal citizens and dedicated workers. The propaganda posters were the instruction manual, showing you what this ideal looked like. This stark contrast between the official image and the lived reality of the communalka is a subject that deeply interests cultural historians. Did anyone actually believe these posters? Did people look at these chiseled, heroic figures and feel inspired? Or did they feel a sense of alienation and inadequacy? The answer is likely complex. For some, especially the young and idealistic, these images might have been a genuine source of inspiration, a goal to strive for. For many others, they must have been a source of quiet cynicism, a daily reminder of the immense gulf between what life was supposed to be and what it actually was. The posters created a visual language that completely erased the realities you knew. They showed spacious, sunny apartments, not cramped, gloomy communal chaos. They showed tables laden with abundant food, not the reality of rationing on cues. And they showed couples united in a single, noble purpose, not couples arguing in whispers about whose turn it is to use the stove or how to find the money for a new pair of shoes. One of the most curious and niche genres of this propaganda was the public health poster about relationships. These were not about love or intimacy, but about hygiene in the broadest sense. A poster might warn young men and women against the dangers of frivolous acquaintances, linking casual relationships to disease and social disorder. A particularly infamous type of poster warned against the dangers of alcohol, often showing a drunkard as a threat to his family and the state. A common image was a weeping wife and child cowering from a father who had spent his wages on vodka. The message was clear. Personal vices have public consequences. Your failure to be a sober, responsible partner is a failure to the collective. Love and relationships were framed almost exclusively in terms of duty, health, and social responsibility. This relentless propaganda had a profound effect on the language people used to talk about their own lives. In your letters to the party, you adopted this language. You talked about your desire for comradely warmth and a healthy, collective family. You framed your personal unhappiness as a political problem. The state's vocabulary became the only acceptable vocabulary, even for the most intimate feelings. The model couple on the poster, with their unsmiling dedication and their gaze fixed on the future, was an impossible ideal. They had no private life, no petty arguments, no messy desires. They were symbols, not people, and this created a deep and lasting tension in Soviet society. You were constantly being measured against an ideal that was not just unattainable, but fundamentally inhuman. And if your real-life relationship, with all its flaws and compromises, failed to live up to this heroic image, the system had a way of dealing with that too. If the ideal socialist marriage didn't work out, trying to end it would plunge you into another bureaucratic and psychological nightmare. The state has told you how to fall in love, how to marry, and what your perfect family should look like. But what happens when this carefully constructed ideal falls apart? What happens when the comradely warmth coalesces into cold resentment and the shared gaze towards the communist future is replaced by averted eyes in a cramped communal room? You decide you want a divorce, and you quickly discover that ending a marriage is even more of a public and political act than starting one. After the Great Retreat of the mid-1930s, the postcard divorce of the revolutionary era was a distant memory. The state, now obsessed with social stability and population growth, viewed divorce as a serious problem. It was a sign of failure, not just a personal failure, but a failure of the collective. It meant that a productive family unit was being broken, and that the state's investment in that family was being wasted. So, they made the process deliberately difficult, expensive, and humiliating. Your first step is not to hire a lawyer, it's to go to court. But this is simple administrative procedure. The first stage is a mandatory reconciliation hearing in a lower-level people's court. You and your spouse must appear before a judge, who is not there to grant your divorce but to try and prevent it. The judge's official role is to act as a state-sponsored marriage counselor, to try and mend the rift and preserve the family unit. Imagine the scene. You are in a small, jammed courtroom. The judge, a stern-faced woman in a simple dress, peers at you over her glasses. She asks you to state your reasons for wanting to dissolve the marriage. But we don't love each other anymore is not an acceptable answer. That is a bourgeois, individualistic reason. You are expected to frame your marital problems in a way that the state can understand. You might say that your husband is a drunkard who is failing in his duties as a worker and a father. He might retort that you are a poor housekeeper who is not raising the children with the correct socialist values. The hearing devolves into a session of mutual accusation, a performance of blame for a state-appointed audience. The judge will lecture you. She will speak of your duty to your children, to society, to the motherland. She will remind you of the importance of the family in building communism. She will try to shame you into staying together. If there are children involved, The pressure is even more intense. The state saw itself as the ultimate guardian of children's welfare, and it believed that welfare was best served by keeping the family intact at almost any cost. If, after this humiliating public airing of your dirty laundry, you still insist on a divorce, the process moves to a higher court, and this is where the real punishment begins. The court fees are exorbitant, sometimes amounting to several months' salary. This alone was enough to make divorce an impossible dream for many working-class people. You also have to place a notice of your divorce proceedings in a local newspaper. This was a form of mandatory public shaming. Your personal failure was now a matter of public record for all your neighbors, colleagues, and friends to see. This is a key area of debate for legal and social historians. Was the primary goal of these policies truly to preserve families, or was it simply to punish those who deviated from the norm? Many argue that the process was less about reconciliation and more about deterrence. The state made divorce so painful and expensive that it hoped people would simply give up and resign themselves to their unhappy marriages. It was social control through bureaucratic attrition. In some cases, the divorce proceedings could even spill over into your workplace. It was not uncommon for a judge to send a notice to your factory S-party, committee, or trade union. They might be asked to hold a meeting to discuss your immoral conduct. You would have to stand before your co-workers and be publicly criticized, struggled with, and re-educated. Your boss and colleagues would weigh in on your personal life, dissecting your failures as a husband or wife. It was the communal kitchen on a grand, institutional scale. A particularly strange and little-known element of this process was the role of the character witness. Both sides could call witnesses to testify to their good character and their spouse's failings. This could turn into a bizarre performance, with neighbors and friends being forced to take sides, offering testimony about who was the better communist, the more responsible parent, or the more dedicated worker. It turned the entire community into participants in the dissolution of your marriage. For many, the process was simply too much to bear. They remained legally married but lived separate lives. Sometimes for decades, they might live in the same small communal room, divided by a curtain, a silent, bitter truce their only connection. The state, on paper, had succeeded. The marriage was preserved, but the human cost of this policy was immense, creating countless prison families bound together not by love, but by bureaucratic and financial chains. And as the decades wore on and the rigid Stalinist era gave way to a long, slow period of stagnation, people found other, less official ways to escape these prisons. The iron grip of the Stalinist years begins to loosen. Just slightly, the Great Terror is over, and the country settles into the long, gray, and oddly stable era of Leonid Brezhnev. This period, from the mid-1960s to the early 1980s, is known as the ZASTOI, the era of stagnation. The revolutionary fervor is gone, replaced by a kind of weary cynicism. The grand promises of a communist utopia have faded, and in their place is a grinding, monotonous reality. The official ideology is still preached everywhere, but fewer and fewer people seem to believe it with any real passion. In this climate of public stagnation and private disillusionment, a new social phenomenon takes root, the double life. People learn to perfect the art of public conformity and private dissent. You go to your job, you attend the party meetings, you say the right things, you applaud at the right times, you perform your role as a loyal Soviet citizen. But in your private life, in the quiet corners of your existence, you do something else entirely. You tell political jokes in the kitchen. You listen to forbidden Western rock music on a crackly tape recorder. And, for many, you engage in secret love affairs. The difficult divorce laws, the suffocating communal chaos, and the general sense of life being a long, boring sentence all contribute to a quiet explosion of infidelity. The affair, or romance or one romance on the side, becomes an almost institutionalized part of life for a significant portion of the urban population. It's not seen as a prelude to divorce and remarriage, because divorce is still a nightmare. Instead, it's a parallel life, a form of escapism, a way to find a spark of passion or emotional connection in a world that offers very little of either. You might be a middle-aged engineer, trapped in a loveless marriage you can't afford to leave. Your affair with a colleague at the research institute is your secret garden. It's a space where you can feel alive, desired, and understood. The relationship exists in stolen moments, a shared lunch that lasts a little too long, a business trip to another city, a quick meeting in a park on the way home from work. The risk of discovery is part of the thrill, a small act of rebellion against the crushing predictability of your official life. This is the era of the dacha, the small country cottage, for those lucky enough to have one. The dacha becomes the primary theater for these secret lives. It's a place away from the prying eyes and ears of the communalka, a small plot of land where you have a semblance of privacy. The weekend trip to the dacha to tend the garden becomes a common alibi for spending time with a lover. The prevalence of this double life is a subject of great interest to sociologists and historians of the period. Was it a sign of society's moral decay, as the state would have claimed, or was it a complex coping mechanism, a way for people to maintain their sanity in a deeply dysfunctional system? Some scholars argue that these affairs were a form of psychological resistance. By carving out a secret emotional space for themselves, people were implicitly rejecting the state's claim to control their entire lives. They were asserting that some part of them, their heart, their desires, remained their own. It was a silent, apolitical rebellion. A curious piece of evidence for this phenomenon comes from the popular culture of the time. While official art still showed heroic tractor drivers, the most beloved films of the Brezhnev era were often melancholy comedies about the absurdities of everyday life. A classic example is Eldar Ryazan OVS 1975 film The Irony of Fate, a movie that is still watched by millions in Russia every New Year's Eve. The plot revolves around a man who gets drunk and is accidentally put on a plane to Leningrad, where he ends up in an apartment identical to his own in Moscow, with the same key and the same address. He meets the woman who lives there, and a complicated romance begins, despite both of them being engaged to other people. The film's immense and lasting popularity speaks to how deeply it resonated with the audience's own experiences of conformity, alienation, and the dream of a chance encounter that could break the monotony of life. In this world of double lives, you learn to be a master of deception. You have alibis, coded phrases, and a network of trusted friends who will cover for you. This creates a strange kind of social contract. There's an unspoken understanding, a sense of don't ask, don't tell. You might suspect your neighbor is having an affair, but you say nothing, because you know they probably suspect the same of you. The culture of denunciation from the Stalin era has softened, replaced by a collective conspiracy of silence. Everyone is hiding something, so it's in everyone's best interest to look the other way. This widespread duplicity, this gap between public morality and private behavior, created a deep societal cynicism that would have profound consequences when the Soviet system finally began to crumble. Generations had learned that the official rules were a sham and that survival depended on your ability to live outside them. And as a few cracks of light from the outside world began to penetrate the Iron Curtain, they brought with them new and desirable symbols of a different way of life, things that would soon become the currency of this hidden romantic economy. The gray stagnation of the Brezhnev era continues, but something new is trickling in through the cracks of the Iron Curtain. It's not an invading army or a new political ideology. It's something softer, more seductive, and, in its own way, more revolutionary. Western culture, a snatch of a Beatles song heard on a Forbidden Voice of America broadcast, a glimpse of a foreign film, a smuggled copy of a glossy magazine. These are windows into a different universe, a world of color, freedom, an effortless school that stands in stark contrast to the drab, uniform reality of Soviet life. And in this new economy of desire, the most sought-after commodities are not tractors or tons of steel. They are blue jeans. A pair of real, American-made jeans. Levi's, Wranglers, Lee, becomes an object of almost mythical status. They are not just trousers, they are a statement. They symbolize everything the Soviet system is not. Individuality, rebellion, a connection to the vibrant, youthful energy of the West. They are also incredibly rare. You can't buy them in a state-run department store. To get a pair, you have to enter the shadowy world of the black market, the fartsovki. The fartsovki are young people who illegally trade in foreign goods. They hang around hotels where foreign tourists stay, or ports where foreign sailors arrive, trying to buy or trade for Western items. A pair of jeans, a pack of Marlboro cigarettes, a vinyl record of Pink Floyd or Deep Purple, a bottle of perfume. These are the new currencies of cool. The risks are high. Being caught could mean arrest for speculation and kowtowing to the West, but the rewards, both in terms of social status and potential profit, are enormous. For a young person trying to navigate the dating world in the 1972, these items become essential tools of courtship. Your access to Western goods is a direct measure of your sophistication and your daring. Imagine trying to impress a young woman. You could recite Pushkin, like your parents did, or you could produce a stick of Wrigley-esque chewing gum. The gum is likely to be far more effective. It's a small, sweet taste of a forbidden world. The ultimate status symbol, the thing that could make you irresistible, is to own a record player and a collection of Western rock LPs. An invitation to come over and listen to the new Boney M album is the 1972's Soviet equivalent of a candlelit dinner. It's an offer of access to a scarce and precious cultural experience. You and a small group of trusted friends might huddle in a communal room, the volume turned down low, listening to the crackly, otherworldly sounds of a band that officially doesn't exist. This shared act of illicit listening creates a powerful bond, a sense of being part of a secret tribe. This phenomenon is a source of constant debate among historians of Soviet culture. Was this just youthful consumerism, a simple desire for fashionable things, or was it a more profound, albeit unconscious, political act? Many scholars argue that this jeans worship was a form of silent protest. By embracing Western style, young people were rejecting the aesthetic of the Soviet state. They were choosing the individual over the collective, the personal over the political. They were voting with their wallets, or rather, with their black market bartering skills. In this context, you might hear about the strange and tragic case of the jeans crime. There are documented instances of people being robbed, assaulted, and even murdered for their Western-made blue jeans. This sounds extreme, but it highlights the incredible value placed on these items. A pair of Levi's could be worth more than a month's salary on the black market. They were an investment, a symbol, and for some, an object worth risking everything for. It's a dark side to the story, a reminder that this cultural importation was happening in a society where scarcity and desperation could turn desire into violence. This new black market of cool had a direct impact on relationships. A young man with connections to a fartsovki chick was a good catch. He could get you jeans, records, maybe even cosmetics. This created a new dynamic in courtship, one based not on comrade-like character or poetic soul, but on access to the forbidden fruits of capitalism. It was a quiet, creeping commercialization of romance, happening right under the nose of a state that had tried for half a century to eliminate market forces from human life. The state, of course, fought back. The Komsomol would organize patrols to shame and harass young people who dressed in a Western style. Newspapers would run articles denouncing the pernicious influence of bourgeois pseudo-culture. But it was a losing battle. The desire for these things was too strong. The allure of the West too powerful. The state could offer heroic, 5-year plans and endless speeches. But the black market was offering blue jeans and rock and roll. And for a generation tired of the grey monotony of stagnation, it was a fair fight. And this longing for a small escape, for a brief taste of a different life, found its perfect expression in another, uniquely Soviet institution, the annual trip to a health spa. For 50 weeks of the year, Your life is a predictable cycle of work, queues, and the suffocating intimacy of the communal. But for 2 weeks, if you are a diligent worker or a member of a union, you might get a put your VKA. This is a state-subsidized voucher for a trip to a health spa, a sanatorium. It is the quintessential Soviet vacation, a cherished institution and one of the few perks of the system. And it is a place where all the strict rules of daily life seem to temporarily bend. You are heading south, to the warm, sunny shores of the Black Sea, to Sochi or Yalta in the Crimea. The train journey itself is part of the experience, a slow, rumbling transition from the gray, industrial north to a world of sea, sun, and relative freedom. The sanatorium is a grand, often imposing building, a relic of either terraced opulence or Stalin as monumental as M. Your days here are structured, but in a way that feels like a parody of real life. You are prescribed a regimen of therapeutic activities, drinking foul-tasting mineral water 3 times a day, taking scheduled naps, undergoing bizarre medical procedures like mud baths or electrotherapy, and going for prescribed walks along the seaside promenade. But no one is really here for the mineral water. The sanatorium is a space of temporary liberation. You are away from your spouse, your boss, and your nosy neighbors. You are surrounded by strangers from all over the Soviet Union, all of them equally eager to shed their dreary everyday skins. The air is thick with a sense of possibility, a holiday spirit that feels almost illicit. The sanatorium becomes the primary breeding ground for the RTNY Roman, the health spa romance. It's a recognized social phenomenon, the subject of countless jokes, songs, and even films. It's a brief, intense, and often bittersweet affair that is understood to have an expiration date. It lasts exactly as long as the put your VKA. The rules are unwritten but universally understood. You don't ask about spouses or families back home. You don't make promises about the future. You exist only in the present. In this 2-week bubble of sunshine and freedom, the evenings are the main event. After a day of therapeutic napping and mud baths, everyone puts on their best, most fashionable clothes, perhaps those black market jeans or a Western-style dress. You gather in the sanatorium's dance hall. A live band plays a mix of staid Soviet patriotic songs and, if they are daring, a few slightly risque pop tunes, or even a clumsy cover of a Western hit. This is where the courtships begin, over a glass of sweet Soviet champagne or a colorful, non-alcoholic cocktail. The conversations are different here. You're not talking about production quotas or the failures of the communal kitchen. You're talking about yourself, your dreams. You can reinvent yourself for 2 weeks. You can be the poet, the adventurer, the sophisticated intellectual from the capital. The person you're talking to is doing the same. It's a shared performance, a brief escape into a more romantic version of yourselves. This phenomenon is a source of endless fascination for social historians. It represents a kind of officially sanctioned loophole in the rigid Soviet social structure. The state provided the venue, the time off, and the subsidy, effectively creating a perfect environment for the very kind of frivolous behavior it officially condemned. Why, some scholars argue, it was an unintentional byproduct of the state's desire to keep its workforce healthy and productive. But a happy, rested worker is a good worker, even if their happiness comes from a source the state wouldn't approve of. Others suggest it was a more conscious safety valve, a way to let people blow off steam and release the pent-up frustrations of their daily lives in a controlled environment, ensuring they would return to their factories and offices more or less content for another year. A peculiar, untelling detail of sanatorium life was the kefir ritual. Every night at around 10 p.m., a nurse would come around with a trolley, dispensing a mandatory glass of kefir, a fermented milk drink, to aid digestion and sleep. This ritual served as a kind of curfew, a gentle, maternalistic reminder that you were still, in the end, under the state scare. The challenge for aspiring lovers was to successfully navigate the evening's romance and be back in their own separate, gender-segregated rooms in time for the kefir trolley. It perfectly encapsulates the sanatorium experience, a tantalizing taste of freedom, but always with the state waiting in the wings with a glass of sour milk. These holiday romances were a vital part of the emotional landscape for many Soviet citizens. They were a source of stories, of memories, of a secret, sun-drenched life that sustained them through the long, gray winters of their real existence. They were a testament to the enduring human need for novelty, connection, and escape. And back in the cities, this growing gap between the official, puritanical narrative and the messy, complicated reality was about to be blown wide open by a single, shocking, and now legendary moment on live television. The year is 1996. The era of stagnation is over, and a new, dynamic leader is in charge. Mikhail Gorbachev has introduced the revolutionary concepts of glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring. For the first time in decades, a fresh breeze is blowing through the stuffy corridors of Soviet power. People are beginning to speak more openly, to question the old dogmas. And this newfound openness leads to one of the most bizarre and revealing moments in television history. It's a space bridge, a live satellite link-up between a studio audience in Boston and one in Leningrad. It's a televised attempt at citizen-to-citizen diplomacy, a project called Women to Women, hosted by the American talk show host Phil Donahue and his Soviet counterpart, Vladimir Posner. The idea is to foster understanding, to break down the Cold War stereotypes. The show proceeds as you might expect. The Soviet women, carefully selected for their loyalty and articulateness, speak about their love for peace, their pride in their work, and the excellence of the Soviet social safety net. The American women ask polite questions. The whole affair is a bit stilted, a carefully managed piece of public relations. Then, an American woman in the Boston studio asks a seemingly innocuous question. She mentions that in America, television commercials have become very sexualized, and she asks if they have a similar problem in the Soviet Union. There's a moment of confusion. The question is translated. The Soviet host, Posner, tries to find a woman in his audience to answer. He hands the microphone to a woman in the front row, a sturdy, matronly figure, and then, with the unflappable confidence of someone stating a simple fact, she looks directly into the camera and utters the phrase that will become an immortal meme of the late Soviet era. She says, "We have no sex." A wave of laughter ripples through the Soviet studio audience. The woman, Lyudmila Ivanova, an administrator in a hotel and a member of a local women's council, seems flustered. She quickly tries to clarify, adding, "On television, and that everything is built on love." But it's too late. The first part of her sentence is all anyone hears, all anyone will remember. "We have no sex." The phrase is an instant sensation. It's a perfect, explosive crystallization of the absurd gap between the official puritanical ideology and the reality of everyone's lives. Of course, she didn't mean that 280 million Soviet citizens were celibate. She was trying to make a point about the lack of commercialized, exploitative sexuality in Soviet media compared to the West. But what she said was a Freudian slip of historic proportions. She had accidentally spoken the official truth, the lie that everyone was supposed to pretend was real. The reaction in the Soviet Union is electric. The phrase is immediately picked up and repeated everywhere. It becomes the punchline to 1,000 jokes. It's a shared, collective moment of the emperor has no clothes. Everyone knows it's not true. And the fact that it was said with such seriousness on an international broadcast makes it all the more hilarious and liberating. It's a moment where the carefully constructed facade of Soviet morality cracks, wide open for the whole world to see. This single sentence has become a subject of intense analysis for cultural historians and sociologists. Why did she say it? And why did it resonate so deeply? Some see it as the ultimate expression of the decades-long indoctrination. Ivanova was so used to the official language of denial and puritanism that it came out automatically, even if she meant something else. Others see it as a moment of profound naivety, a genuine bewilderment at the American concept of using sex to sell products. The debate continues, but what's undeniable is the impact. The phrase became a symbol of the entire Soviet attitude towards intimacy, a public posture of absolute denial that masked a private reality of immense complexity and contradiction. A lesser-known detail from that same space bridge adds another layer of irony. After Ivanov's famous declaration, the host, Phil Donahue, ever the showman, turned to the Leningrad audience and asked, "Then how do you have babies?" This prompted another wave of laughter and a sense of shared embarrassment. It was a simple, common-sense question that laid bare the absurdity of the official stance. The "we have no sex" moment was more than just a funny gaffe. It was a cultural landmark. It signaled that the old way of speaking, the old denials, were no longer tenable in the age of glasnost. The public was ready, even desperate, to start talking about the things that had been kept in the shadows for so long. The genie was out of the bottle, and it could not be put back in. This newfound openness would soon find its way into the one medium that had, for decades, been the most tightly controlled purveyor of Soviet reality, the cinema. The phrase "we have no sex" hangs in the air, a national inside joke that has broken a long-held taboo. The floodgates of glasnost are opening wider, and the murky, complicated realities of Soviet life, so long hidden, begin to seep into the public consciousness. And the first place you see this dramatic shift is on the silver screen. For decades, Soviet cinema was a landscape of heroic workers, chaste collective farmers, and ideologically pure soldiers. Now, for the first time, it starts to look a little more like life itself. A new genre of film emerges, known as Chernyukha, which literally translates to blackness or dark stuff. These films turn their cameras away from the shining communist future and focus instead on the grim, gritty, and often hopeless reality of the present. They show the poverty, the crime, the alcoholism, and the crushing spiritual emptiness of late Soviet society. And, for the first time, they begin to talk about sex. One of the most groundbreaking and controversial films of this era is Vasily Pikhal's 1988 Little Vera, Malenькая Vera. Watching it for the first time is a shocking experience. The film is set in a bleak, industrial port city. The heroine, Vera, is a rebellious teenager who clashes with her alcoholic father and world-weary mother in their cramped apartment. She wears trashy makeup, listens to loud rock music, and hangs out with a rough crowd. And then, the film does something unprecedented in mainstream Soviet cinema. It shows a sex scene. It's not glamorous or romantic. It's awkward, a bit clumsy, and shot with a stark, unblinking realism. The scene itself is relatively brief and not graphically explicit by Western standards, but in the context of Soviet cinema, it is a cultural atom bomb. Audiences in cinemas across the country watch in stunned silence, a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and thrill. Here, finally, is a depiction of intimacy that isn't cloaked in poetic metaphors or shots of wheat fields. It's real, it's messy, and it's happening in an apartment that looks exactly like theirs. Little Vera becomes a massive box office hit and a cultural phenomenon. It's furiously debated in the press and in kitchens across the country. The conservatives and party hardliners are outraged, calling it pornography, a slander against Soviet youth, and a disgusting example of Western decay. The liberals and the young generation hail it as a breath of fresh air, a long overdue dose of truth. The film's impact goes far beyond that one scene. It portrays a family disintegrating under the pressures of poverty and alcoholism. It shows a youth culture that is deeply alienated from the official ideology, finding solace only in cheap booze and casual relationships. It's a portrait of the STOI generation's dead end, a world where the old values have collapsed and no new ones have taken their place. This sudden turn towards realism in cinema is a hot topic for film historians. Was it a top-down phenomenon, a result of Gorbachev's government deliberately loosening the reins of censorship as part of the glasnost policy? Or was it a bottom-up revolution, with filmmakers who had been bottling up these stories for years finally seizing the opportunity to get them made? The answer, as usual, is a bit of both. The state relaxed its control, and a generation of talented and frustrated directors rushed into the opening. A lesser-known but equally significant aspect of these Chern Yokai-ha films was their portrayal of the communalka. For decades, the communal apartment was either ignored in cinema or presented in a sanitized, almost cheerful light. These new films showed the reality, the squalor, the lack of privacy, the simmering resentments, the way these living conditions warped and damaged human relationships. The thin walls of the communalka became a powerful cinematic metaphor for the suffocating nature of Soviet life itself. The success of Little Vera opens the door for other films to explore previously forbidden territory. Films begin to touch on topics like prostitution, drug abuse, and even, cautiously, the legacy of Article 121. The cinematic landscape is transformed almost overnight from a predictable showcase of socialist virtues into a chaotic, often bleak, but vibrant and truthful reflection of a society in turmoil. The state-sponsored image of the strong, healthy, asexual Soviet citizen, so carefully maintained for over half a century, is shattered. In its place is Little Vera, smoking a cigarette on a dirty balcony, looking out over a landscape of industrial decay. Her face a mixture of boredom and defiance. She is the new face of the late Soviet Union, disillusioned, cynical, and searching for a moment of genuine feeling in a world that has offered her nothing but lies. And as the public begins to grapple with these new, honest images, a parallel revolution is happening in a much quieter, more academic sphere. The first attempts at actual sex education. The movies are showing you a raw, uncensored version of life. The taboo on discussing sex in public has been broken, but 70 years of official silence and ideological distortion have left a profound void. People are talking, but they don't have the language. They are grappling with their own lives in a state of almost medieval ignorance about the basics of human biology and psychology. Into this void, tentatively and with incredible awkwardness, steps the first generation of Soviet sex educators. You come across a new book, perhaps in a dusty corner of a bookstore or passed around among friends. It's a slim volume with a plain, clinical-looking cover. The title might be something like The Ethics and Psychology of Family Life or Hygiene for Young Women. These are the first widely available sex education manuals, and reading them is a bizarre experience. They are written not with the warmth of an advice columnist or the frankness of a modern health teacher, but with the dry, detached tone of an engineering textbook. The authors are usually doctors or sexopathologists, a very Soviet term, and they approach the subject as if it's a particularly complex and slightly distasteful mechanical process. The language is dense, scientific, and utterly devoid of any sense of pleasure, emotion, or romance. You open the book, looking for answers. The chapter on human anatomy might contain a few grainy, black and white diagrams that look like they were borrowed from a 19th century medical journal. The text describes the reproductive organs with a sterile, Latinic precision. There is no mention of desire, attraction, or intimacy. It is pure mechanics. The chapter on the psychology of the sexes is even more strange. It's a mishmash of outdated biological determinism and lingering Soviet ideology. It might explain that men are naturally more assertive and have a stronger sexual constitution, while women are naturally more passive, emotional, and oriented towards motherhood. It's an attempt to provide a scientific basis for the traditional gender roles that the state now promoted. Contraception, if mentioned at all, is discussed briefly and with a sense of weary resignation. The book might list the available methods, the infamous product number 2, withdrawal, the rhythm method, and dutifully note their low rates of effectiveness. It might warn against the dangers of abortion without offering any truly reliable alternatives. The overwhelming message is one of caution, danger, and the need for restraint. This clumsy attempt at sex education is a fascinating subject for historians of science and medicine. It reveals a system trying to catch up with reality after decades of willful ignorance. The authors of these books were in an impossible position. They were trying to provide practical information in a society that was still deeply puritanical and suspicious of the topic. They had to cloak their advice in layers of medical jargon and ideological boilerplate to make it acceptable to the censors. The debate is whether these books did more harm than good. Did they provide some crucial, basic information to a deeply uninformed public? Or did they just reinforce harmful stereotypes and create even more anxiety around the natural part of life? The particularly telling and often humorous detail in these manuals is the advice on courtship. They might offer a scientific guide to a successful marriage, with advice that sounds like it was written by a robot. A typical recommendation might be, for a harmonious union, it is advisable for spouses to share a similar level of intellectual development and to hold congruent views on the leading role of the party. Another might suggest that the optimal time for sexual relations is on a weekend, so as not to interfere with labor productivity during the week. It's an attempt to fit the messy, unpredictable chaos of human relationships into a neat, rational, and ideologically sound box. These books, for all their flaws, were a start. They were an admission that people had questions and that the old answers, or the old silence, were no longer sufficient. They represented the very beginning of a long, slow process of untangling the knots of fear, shame, and misinformation that the Soviet system had tied around the topic of intimacy. And just as these books were appearing, a new kind of professional was also emerging from the shadows. Someone you could actually talk to face, about these problems. The first Soviet sex therapists. The books are clinical and unsatisfying. The films are raw but offer no solutions. You are living in a society that is just beginning to acknowledge the existence of private life, and you are filled with questions and anxieties that have been accumulating for a lifetime. For the first time, a nude door opens. A small, discreet plaque appears on a clinic building bearing a strange new title, Sexopathologist or Family Counseling Center. You decide to go. The act itself feels revolutionary, a mixture of courage and shame. You walk into a sterile, institutional waiting room. It feels less like a therapist's office and more like any other state-run polyclinic. You sit nervously, avoiding eye contact with the other people waiting, all of you united in a silent, awkward communion of private troubles. Finally, your name is called. You enter the small office. The person sitting behind the desk is likely a medical doctor, probably a psychiatrist or a urologist who has received some specialized and very new training in sexopathology. This field, which had been suppressed for decades, was just beginning its slow, painful rebirth in the Soviet Union. These were the pioneers, the first generation of professionals trying to apply science to the realm of human intimacy. You sit down and begin to talk, and what comes out is a lifetime of confusion, shaped by the unique pressures of Soviet life. A man might come in, deeply distressed about what he perceives as his failure to live up to the masculine ideal, his anxieties fueled by a lifetime of propaganda about strength and virility. A woman might confess her complete lack of pleasure or desire in her marriage, something she has always been taught to accept as normal. A couple, trapped in a loveless marriage by the difficult divorce laws and housing shortages, might come seeking a cure for their incompatibility, as if it were a medical ailment. The therapists themselves are in a difficult position. They are armed with a new, but still limited, set of tools. Their approach is heavily medicalized. They see these problems not as complex, emotional, or relational issues, but as physiological or psychological dysfunctions that can be diagnosed and treated. They might prescribe sedatives for anxiety, recommend a regimen of physical exercise, or give you a series of stiff, formal exercises to perform with your partner. The idea of talk therapy as we know it, a deep exploration of feelings and history, is still a largely alien concept. This early stage of Soviet sexology is a rich field of study for historians. They examine how these therapists tried to blend modern scientific knowledge with the prevailing Soviet ideology. For example, a therapist might explain a person's low libido by linking it to work-related fatigue or anxiety about fulfilling the production plan. The solution, therefore, would be a better work-life balance and a more positive attitude towards one's role in the collective. The personal problem is once again framed in political and social terms. It was a way of making this new, sensitive field palatable to the authorities. A fascinating and little-known aspect of this period was the work of the early researchers, like the famous Igor. Khan was a sociologist and anthropologist who became one of Russia's most prominent and courageous scholars of sexuality in the late Soviet period. He began conducting the first ever sociological surveys on sexual behavior in the country. The results, when he was finally able to publish them, were a bombshell. They revealed a population that was deeply dissatisfied, profoundly ignorant about basic sexual health, and struggling with high rates of dysfunction. His work provided the first real data to counter the official narrative of the happy, healthy Soviet family. He was a controversial figure, often attacked by conservatives. That his work was groundbreaking. In the therapist's office, you might be one of the many people bringing in problems that are uniquely Soviet. Perhaps you are a couple from a communalka whose entire intimate life has been poisoned by the absolute lack of privacy. The therapist can't give you a new apartment, so they might offer coping strategies. Have you considered taking walks together more often, or visiting a museum? It's a well-intentioned, but ultimately inadequate solution to a systemic problem. These early counseling centers were a crucial, if flawed, first step. They were an admission by the state that the health of a family involved more than just its productive and reproductive capacity. It involved emotions, satisfaction, and psychology. They provided a space, however clinical and awkward, for people to voice the unvoicable. They were a sign that the iron wall between the public and the private was finally beginning to crumble, and as it crumbled, it exposed the legal architecture that had caused so much suffering for so long, and the pressure to dismantle it became unbearable. The most notorious of these laws, the one that had criminalized a whole class of citizens, was now living on borrowed time. The Soviet Union itself is unraveling. The year is 1991. The red flag is lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The monolithic state that for 74 years tried to engineer every aspect of human life has ceased to exist. In the chaotic, exhilarating, and terrifying aftermath, the new, fledgling Russian Federation begins the monumental task of dismantling the legal and social structures of its predecessor. And one of the most symbolic and long overdue acts of this period is the final confrontation with Article 121. The law is still on the books. Men are still being arrested, tried, and imprisoned for loving other men. But in the new atmosphere of nascent democracy and human rights discourse, its existence has become an international embarrassment and a rallying cry for Russia's first, small, and very brave gay rights activists. These activists are a new breed. They are no longer hiding in the shadows of the PLES-HK. They are organizing, publishing underground newsletters, Samizdat, and, for the first time, protesting in public. They hold small, risky demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg, holding signs that demand the repeal of the infamous article. They face harassment from the police, violent attacks from nationalist thugs, and the general bewilderment of a public that is still deeply homophobic. But they refuse to be silent. You are witnessing a historic struggle. The debate over Article 121 moves into the new Russian parliament, the Duma. The arguments for its repeal are based on principles of universal human rights, privacy, and the need for Russia to join the civilized world. The opponents, a powerful coalition of communists, nationalists, and representatives of the increasingly influential Orthodox Church, fight back with the same old rhetoric. They speak of Western corruption, the threat to traditional values, and the need to protect children from propaganda of perversion. It is the old Soviet ideology, stripped of its Marxist-Leninist jargon, but retaining all of its prejudice. The process is slow and fraught with political battles. The international pressure is immense. Human rights organizations and Western governments make the repeal of Article 121 a key condition for Russia's acceptance into international bodies like the Council of Europe. for the new government under Boris Yeltsin, eager for international legitimacy and financial aid. This is a powerful incentive. This legislative battle is a complex topic for legal historians. They debate the true motivations behind the final decision. Was it a genuine, principled commitment to human rights on the part of the new Russian leadership, or was it a pragmatic, cynical move, a concession made to the West in exchange for political and economic support? The consensus among many scholars is that it was largely the latter. The repeal was less a victory of domestic tolerance and more a product of foreign policy expediency. The hearts and minds of the majority of the population, and even many of the politicians, had not changed, but the geopolitical calculation had. Finally, on May 27, 1993, it happens. President Yeltsin signs the law that officially strikes Article 121 from the Russian Criminal Code. After 60 years, consensual sexual acts between adult men are no longer a crime in Russia. It is a moment of profound, historic significance for the thousands of men who had lived their lives in fear, who had seen friends and lovers arrested, who had been blackmailed or imprisoned. It is a liberation, but the legacy of a law is not erased with the stroke of a pen. The criminalization was gone, but the social stigma remained, deeply ingrained in the culture. A fascinating and tragic detail from this period is the police's reaction to the repeal. For a while, some police officers continued to arrest gay men, either out of ignorance of the new law or out of old habit, and they found a new tool, hooliganism statutes or public decency laws, which they used to harass and intimidate people in known cruising areas. The legal justification had changed, but the persecution on the ground often continued. The repeal of Article 121 did not usher in a golden age of LGBTQ rights in Russia. It was a crucial first step, a removal of the most brutal to love state oppression. But it did not stop discrimination in housing and employment. It did not end social prejudice. It did not stop the violence. The light blue world, for so long a hidden, underground network, could now technically exist in the open. But it found the open air to be just as hostile in many ways. The story of Article 121, its long and brutal life and its eventual demise, is a powerful chapter in the larger story of the Soviet experiment. It shows how an ideology could turn a private act of love into a political crime, and its repeal shows how legal change, while essential, is only one part of a much longer, more difficult struggle to change a society as heart. The law was gone, but the ghost of it, the deep-seated fear and prejudice it had fostered for generations, would continue to haunt the private lives of millions, a phantom limb of a totalitarian past. This was just one of the many complex, often contradictory legacies left behind by the collapsed empire. The Soviet Union is a ghost. Its statues have been toppled, its name erased from the map. You are now living in a new Russia, a chaotic, turbulent world of nascent capitalism and bewildering freedom. The old certainties, however oppressive, are gone. The old rules that governed your private life, the fear of the denunciation, the difficulty of divorce, the criminalization of desire, have been swept away. But a 70-year social experiment doesn't just end. It leaves behind an inheritance, a complex and often toxic set of red legacies that continue to shape the way people think about love, family, and intimacy. The most immediate legacy is the deepened abiding cynicism about the state and any official pronouncements about morality. For generations, people lived a double life, paying lip service to a puritanical ideology that no one in power actually followed. This taught a powerful lesson. The rules are for suckers. The public narrative is a lie. This has led to a profound distrust of any attempt to regulate private life. But it has also created a kind of moral vacuum. The old framework is gone, but a new, widely accepted one has not yet emerged. You see the legacy of the communalka everywhere. Millions of people, even after the collapse of the USSR, continue to live in these crowded conditions for years. But even for those who have moved into their own private apartments, the psychological imprint remains. There is a deep-seated craving for privacy, a fierce, almost obsessive guarding of one's personal space, At the same time, the old habits of minding other people's business, of judging one's neighbors, persist. The kitchen table tribunal may have lost its political power, but its social function as a center for gossip and judgment continues. The relationship between men and women is burdened by the weight of this history. Decades of a prone at A-list policy that was not supported by real social infrastructure put an immense double burden on women. They were expected to be both full-time workers in the Soviet economy and full-time mothers and homemakers, the heroines of the domestic front. This legacy of the superwoman who is expected to do it all, without complaint, continues to shape gender roles and expectations in the post-Soviet era. The history of contraception and abortion has also left deep scars. The reliance on abortion as the primary means of birth control continued long after the fall of the Soviet Union. This abortion culture, born of state failure, has had long-term consequences for women's health and for the way society views reproductive choices. The conversation around contraception is still decades behind the West, shrouded in misinformation and a lingering sense of it being somehow unnatural or unnecessary. This is a point of ongoing study for public health historians. How does a society unlearn such a deeply ingrained and harmful practice when the state itself created it? The legacy of Article 121 and the state-sponsored homophobia is perhaps one of the most poisonous. While the law was repealed, the attitudes it fostered were not. The association of homosexuality with fascism, the West, and moral decay proved incredibly durable. This prejudice, once promoted by the Communist Party, was eagerly picked up by new ideological forces. The Orthodox Church and ultranationalist politicians, they repurposed the old Soviet fear-mongering for a new era, presenting themselves as defenders of traditional Russian values against a corrupt and decadent West. The light blue world, which had hoped for a new dawn of freedom, found itself facing a new, and in some ways more unpredictable, form of hostility. A curious and little discussed legacy is the Soviet approach to romance itself. For decades, love was supposed to be serious, purposeful, and ideally linked to building a better society. The idea of love being fun, playful, or spontaneous was seen as bourgeois and frivolous. This has left a kind of emotional stiffness, a difficulty with expressing affection openly and easily. The grand, tragic, all-or-nothing love of Russian literature was acceptable. The simple, everyday joy of a happy partnership was much harder to articulate or even value. All these threads, the cynicism, the housing trauma, the skewed gender roles, the reproductive health crisis, the deep-seated homophobia, the emotional formality, are the inheritance of the Soviet attempt to engineer the human heart. The state tried to create a new Soviet person who was rational, collective-minded, and asexual. It failed, of course, but in the process of failing, it twisted and deformed the private lives of generations. It created a society that was simultaneously deeply traumatized and incredibly resilient. And as you stand in the rubble of this collapsed empire, you are left to ponder the central question of this entire grand, tragic experiment. So, we arrive back at our original question, the one that prompted this long journey through cramped kitchens and sun-drenched sanatoriums. Was the Soviet Union really a sexless society? The answer, you now see, is a resounding, uncomplicated no. It was the opposite. The Soviet Union was a society completely, undoubtedly obsessed with sex. It was an obsession that manifested not as celebration, but as control. The state, in its vast, clumsy, and totalitarian ambition, sought to manage, channel, suppress, and instrumentalize the most private human desires for its own political ends. Every aspect of intimacy became a matter of state policy. The official public face of the USSR was, indeed, sexless. It was the world of the propaganda poster, chaste, heroic, and focused on production. It was the world of Lyudmila Ivanovna's famous declaration on television. It was a carefully constructed facade of puritanical virtue. This was the image the state projected to itself and to the world. And for a long time, this was the only version of the story that was told. But behind that facade, you have seen the teeming, messy, and desperate reality. You've walked the tightrope of a courtship conducted in parks and coded whispers. You've felt the chilling fear of a positive pregnancy test in a world without reliable contraception, where rubber product number 2 was a grin joke. You've imagined the terror of the kitchen table abortion, a direct consequence of the state's demand for more babies. You've felt the cold dread of Article 121, a law that turned love into a crime and forced man into a hidden, light blue world of secret signals and constant paranoia. You've sat in the communal, where the thin walls turned every neighbor into an unwilling audience and a potential informant, making privacy the ultimate luxury. You've experienced the bizarre freedom of the sanatorium romance, a state-sanctioned escape valve for a populace suffocating under the weight of official morality. The state didn't eliminate sexuality, it simply drove it underground and, in doing so, warped it into new and resilient shapes. Desire, denied a legitimate outlet, became a black market commodity, just like a pair of Levis jeans or a Beatles record. It became a form of quiet rebellion, a secret garden cultivated in the shadow of the factory smokestack. The double life, affair on the side, became not an exception, but for many, a necessary strategy for psychological survival in the great twilight of the Brezhnev era. Historians today continue to explore this vast contradiction, and the ultimate purpose of this immense project of social engineering remains a subject of debate. Was the primary goal really to create a more focused and productive workforce, as Lenin had argued? Was it a pro-natalist obsession, a demographic numbers game to fuel the engines of industry and the military, as Stalin's policies would suggest? Or was it, at its core, simply about power, the totalitarian impulse to control every facet of human existence, to erase the very concept of a private sphere that was not subject to state supervision? The most likely answer is that it was all of these things at once, a tangled knot of ideology, pragmatism, and paranoia. The final, poignant detail to consider is the very language that evolved. The fact that slang terms like Gola Boy, the musician's clarinet, or the whole mythology around product number 2 even existed is profound. It shows a population creating its own vocabulary to describe a reality that the official language refused to acknowledge. It is the ultimate proof that you can control the newspapers, the films, and the schools, but you cannot fully control the human spirit or the words it will invent to tell its own story. The sexless Soviet Union was a myth, a carefully maintained illusion. The reality was a society where sex was everywhere, in the laws, in the fears, in the back alley whispers, in the desperate letters to the party, and in the quiet, resilient ways people found to love, connect, and survive in the cracks of a system that tried, and ultimately failed, to build a new world by denying a fundamental part of the old one. And so, our journey through the hidden corners of the Soviet heart comes to an end. The story, with all its great owns and quiet desperation begins to fade, much like an old, water-stained photograph. The sharp edges of the communalka, the cold weight of the decrees, the whispered fears, they all soften now, losing their form and dissolving into the gentle hum of your room. You can feel the narrative thread loosening, letting you drift away from the crowded apartments and the Black Sea promenades. The weight of that history is lifting, becoming as light and as distant as a half-remembered dream. You are no longer there. You are here, safe in your own space, in your own time. The sounds of that other world, the crackle of the radio, the distant clang of a tram, the strained whispers through a thin wall, are replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of your own breathing. Let each breath pull you further away from that past, deeper into the quiet comfort of this present moment. The characters we met, the lives we glimpsed, are now just echoes, fading into the vast, silent archives of the night. There are no more quotas to meet, no more rules to follow, no more secrets to keep. There is only the stillness, the growing sense of peace, and the gentle, gravitational pull of a deep and restful sleep. Your own bed is your sanctuary, your privacy absolute, and as you finally let go, you can feel yourself floating on that slow, quiet river that carries us all from wakefulness into the landscape of our dreams. The end of the article. Good night.